part 2 then, which is how does one go about, implementing when you talk about use of these technologies. The first step, of course, is the conceptualization. And people think, oh my God, conceptualization of using new and emerging technologies. How do I do that? I am not an expert in AI or big data and so on. The fact is, you don't really need to know a whole lot. You need to know as much about new and emerging technologies as you need to know about automotive engineering when you drive a car. It's that simple. So you have to have an awareness, obviously, of these new technologies and their uses. But what's critical is for a person who is in the government or involved in such a project, the domain knowledge of the sector, both inside the government and outside. What are the kind of innovations? What are the kind of business trends that are happening? And what are the kind of disruptions that are taking place? The second is the soft skills, understanding human behavior, the fears that people have. Oh, I'm going to lose my job, or oh, I'm not going to be able to control the outcome, or I'm not going to be able to prevent something from happening. These kind of concerns sometimes retard adoption. And while looking at all these questions, I think what is important is to think from the citizen perspective. How would you, even as a government employee, want this to happen if you are not in the government? So before you call in tech experts or consultants, there must be a clarity on what is the outcome that you want to achieve. Or even if you are not very clear on the outcome, at least what is the problem that you're trying to resolve? For example, in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, one simple problem was just to file quarterly returns. Companies usually took 2 days. People had to queue up before the ROC's office. And sometimes, believe it or not, it took 48 hours to just physically deposit those forms. So that was the problem one of the problems which MCA 21 was designed to address. Today, it's all instant and online. While looking at and trying to conceptualize the use, it's also important to have a little perspective of how, as a country and as a government, I'm talking here in general, not just the central government or the state governments, but in general. How did we get here? And I'm not going to go into a detailed history. This is not the time or the place, but 2004 onwards, 2004 to 2008 was the first phase when the NEGP, the National E-Governance Plan, was approved, and a lot of infrastructure and mission mode projects, and all of them were conceived. And in fact, the IT industry had grown to a point where PPPs were also possible, public-private partnerships with the private sector. MCA 21 was a PPP, Passports was a PPP project. And the mobile revolution was also powered by the private sector in India, and it really blossomed in this period. 2008 to 2014 was when the mobile revolution became very pervasive. And of course, there was some turbulence also in the sector at that time. And the UID project was also cleared by the cabinet at that time. In fact, I remember making all my presentations to the EGOM at that time on the UID project, why it was required, what benefits it would bring, etc. And the IT industry had a really global footprint. And post 2014 to now, we have seen the rise of social media, mobile, analytics, cloud, and smartphones, and citizens becoming digital, the rise of e-commerce and the whole digital government and so on, and a globally dominant IT industry. The result of all this is that today, in most cases, there is in almost every government organization of any significant size and scale, there is some existing level of computerization, and that's the base which exists. Which brings me to step 2, after conceptualization, that what you want to do and which problem you want to solve and what you want to achieve. To review what is already existing. You can't just discard that whole system and say, look, I am going to junk all of this and start all over again. That is fine if there are no significant or useful existing IT systems. Then you have to plan it like a greenfield project, the way MCA 21 was designed, or the way the Passport Seva project, the citizen side of it, was designed, because that didn't exist at that time. And sometimes, one becomes very ambitious. The E-Pragati project in AP, which tried to bring a whole of government approach. There was nothing wrong in the approach or the design, but it was so ambitious and didn't take into account the fact that the government as a whole rarely moves in a very organized, disciplined manner. Different parts are moving at a different pace, sometimes in different directions, and so on. Even when COVID modeling was done, so much of information had to be pulled in from so many different places. In many cases, there were not enough systems in place, so different solutions had to be found. But in many cases, there is already a robust IT base. It's just that it is not currently catering to the citizen side of things. So in that case, it makes sense to actually try and build on top of that, use that robust base, because that has come after a lot of effort. So if that is found adequate, then you can actually do the project development riding on the existing system. So it's like a brownfield project. Examples are, the kind of mobile apps which were designed for ASHA workers, or the Nikshay, where the TB, the examples I mentioned about, loss to follow-up of TB, the likely dropouts, etc. Then the GSTN, building fraud detection on top of the existing database, or income tax, similarly, similar types of services. So all of these have actually built on top of whatever was already existing. But while many things have changed and the environment has changed, the surroundings have changed, the technology has changed, there are still some age-old ground rules for e-governance projects which remain valid even today. And it's important to keep that perspective in mind, that when you are implementing these e-governance projects which deliver a government service, only 20% of the success is because of technology. 30% is on how you rejig the processes. I was mentioning that, it's important to look at processes which require people to come to government offices and ask the question, is it really necessary? Is it inevitable? And then 50% of it is managing change. When the Passport Seva project was implemented, there were a lot of apprehensions. All the people who were working in passport offices said, if you implement this project, what will happen to us? We are going to lose our job, or we are not going to get the overtime that we were getting earlier. So all of these kinds of questions are valid questions and need to be answered. The second is that you must capture data at the source. If you don't, then there will always be the kind of gaps that we saw, for example, in the COVID projections. Either it is not comprehensive, or each data record is not complete, or it's not accurate, or it is not current. All kinds of problems with the data which you can imagine. So, but on the other hand, if you look at the vaccination drive which was done recently, it's a phenomenal example of how data was captured right at the source. And interestingly, not just from government organizations, but even from private entities. So the data was current, the data was accurate, and the data was complete because you required certain amount of data to be put in. And that brought the miracle of how the whole COVID was dealt with in India in comparison to so many other countries, both developed and developing. I've talked about the process and the procedure part, and the next is, to first decide on the project outcomes for the citizens. What's the outcome for the citizens? I think that should come first. And then, of course, for the government also. Obviously, we must look at how does government also functioning improve. So the technology should always come later. Some of the worst examples of approach is where people say, I'm going to computerize everything. It's a meaningless statement. Or somebody says, I'm going to use AI in a big way. Why? So these things are not done for the sake of technology. There has to be a larger purpose that is driving the adoption. And as I said, a lot of technology can be outsourced today. You can implement standard processes. And even if an individual officer is smart and tech savvy, it's important to remember two things. One, the rest of the department may not be as smart and tech savvy as you are. And the second is that you're not going to be there forever. But these systems are being built for a long, long time. They will be there for decades and maybe more. So it's important to build the institutional support for these kind of projects. So why sometimes we need the private sector in this. One, of course, is the obvious question of quantity. You have nearly 4 million people, 4 to 5 million people employed by the private sector, whereas the number in the government across state, center, and all the government agencies is hardly a few thousand. So talent, both in terms of the quantity as well as in some cases of the quality. There are undoubtedly some extremely capable and smart people in the government, but as a general proposition, some of the public sector service providers often lack the latest technology talent or the familiarity with business practices which are being adopted, like this whole omni-channel approach, the kind of innovation, and most importantly, the customer orientation, because that is not the way that traditionally government has been handling it. But yet, in many cases, public sector service providers are often taken because they are the easy way out, not because they are the best suited. The other aspect is it's important to maintain a distinction, even when the private sector is brought in, between the delivery of the service and the decision that is involved in making the service. That decision has to remain a government decision, like in the case of passports or income tax or MCA. But the service delivery, which is actually the pain point for the citizens in terms of access, in terms of speed, in terms of transparency, that can very easily and effectively be outsourced. And it brings increased transparency. But when you use things like AI, then sometimes people want to know why. It's not good enough to say, well, the AI system has said that you are not eligible. It has to be explained. So increasingly, the trend is to rely on explainable AI, where the AI itself explains how it came to that conclusion. Then we get into actual implementation. Let's suppose the conceptualization has been done and the assessment of where things stand is over, and now we are going into implementation. So how do you resource that implementation idea? So first is, as I said, the option one is to get the assistance from a government agency. You can go to the NIC, or you can go to CDAC or NEGD or some state PSU which is there, which can help to conceptualize and implement the project. And the GEM, for example, was done like that. The e-immigration and a lot of the work in the passports and in income tax and so on were done by the NIC in the earlier stages. But some of the disadvantages are that this often leads to incremental conceptualization, because there is no discipline required to completely put down everything that is needed in a systematic way. And as I said, sometimes the implementation agency may not also have all the skills that are required. So, which is why we also have to look at the option number two, which is for the conceptualization stage itself onwards, you can actually use volunteers and honorary advisors to develop the concept. As I said, the initial concept may have got done, but you can use, today there are lots of options of where you can go to get such voluntary or honorary advisors. There are public-minded tech specialists. For example, you have the International Innovation Corps, which provides interns at their cost. Not-for-profit organizations such as WITP, or a group of volunteer people like iSpurt, or there's so many other such agencies. And we've seen a heavy use of these approaches in the case of the Aadhaar project, in the case of the National Health Authority and the Digital Health Blueprint. The advantage which this approach is that there is no procurement process and no funding involved, and you can bring in some really high caliber individuals who are motivated by nothing but public service. But the disadvantages also are that sometimes this can bring in unknown agendas, especially when some of the volunteers belong to a private company. So there are, one has to weigh all these aspects very carefully. And then after you have completed the detailing of the conceptualization to a level where you can actually bid it out, because in this case, when you're using the private sector, everything has to be detailed, because at the end of the day, it has to be reduced to a contract. And that requires the use of consultants, whether bodies like the NISG, which is a not-for-profit, or Big Four, like the big consulting houses or other similar entities. There are many such agencies which can detail the concept and design the RFP, the request for proposals, which will include the service level agreements, master services agreement, and which can help to manage the bid process and help identify the what is actually needed. So this is how it happened in the case of GSTN. This is how it happened in the case of the CSCs. And it's critical in this case because you are looking for innovation, you are using the private sector, and you never know what is the danger which you are overlooking. So it's important to have a very open bid process, release even the draft RFP for discussion, release the eligibility criteria for a discussion to get wide consultation, because sometimes the eligibility criteria eliminate small companies which have tremendous capabilities. And it's also important to look at PPP options, public-private partnership options, where a turnkey responsibility is given. But it's important to have appropriate risk allocation and not dump all the risks apart from the technology risk. Governmental risks cannot be, the likelihood of employees accepting or resisting, that cannot be jumped onto a private partner. And exploring the possibility of using startups in specific contexts is also something that is certainly worth looking at. So basically, I think we have to look at mirroring some of the private sector best practices in the way government interfaces with citizens. Think about it from a citizen or a business perspective. Omni-channel services I've already talked about. The personalized services, what's called customer relationship management by the private sector, can be very well called the citizen relationship management by the government. And the APIs are very important because they allow innovative value-added services to be built by the private sector around the core government services. And enhancing trust, I think one of the questions also had come up. The two-factor authentication in financial transactions, for example, has brought the use of PIN and so on, has brought a huge level of trust in financial transactions. But it's not as if private sector is a kind of panacea. There are many challenges here. There's a complex techno-commercial procurement process. There's a need for clarity on the end goals and deliverables, and how you use volunteers, which volunteers can be used, can't be used, etc. The contractual rigidity is another big problem because the private sector works on the basis of, very strict financials, profit and losses. And you can't just change the terms without considering, how much additional burden it puts on the private sector. And conversely, the private sector generally doesn't understand very well how the government functions and how things keep changing. So all of these, I think, are some issues and challenges. And a lot of the procurement clauses, they eliminate innovation. You say the company has to be there for at least 3-4 years. It has to have a turnover of, 100 crore. Effectively, you're saying that, startups and innovation are strictly prohibited. So that's, I think, a serious limitation. And sometimes because of all these, people are worried about watchdog agencies, focusing on some mistake somewhere and then putting the officers into trouble. And so they say, why do all this? Maybe I best go to a Sarkari organization. So these are some of the challenges. I'll just give you 2 quick examples of how the voluntary services were used. For example, this TB, the identifying dropouts or predicting dropouts was one thing which was done for the CTD, department under the Health Ministry. And this was done by the Wadhwani Institute of Artificial Intelligence for them and developed. And it was good that, the need was there, the agency was there, and it was directly brought into the picture. But here also, there were huge challenges in terms of getting access to the data. Nobody knew, they were not willing to transfer data, rightly so. But then they were not willing to provide access to the data. And resultantly, it was a big problem to work out. Nobody knew what anonymization is or how it can be implemented. And this privacy law also was in the background. So I think to sum up, as we conclude, I think the questions to ponder is, how is governance changing as it goes digital? What do you think it will look like when it becomes fully digital and fully connected? And how can your sector or department that you serve be positioned for that digital future? So I think these are some of the questions which need to be pondered over, and obviously the answers are very context specific. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm open to any questions. As I said, the whole idea of these new and emerging technologies is to facilitate inclusion and facilitate personalization and ensure that things are designed to cater to the citizens' convenience and the citizens' needs rather than the government's ability or the government's needs. So, and that's what is possible with these technologies. I mean, if you take UPI as an example, that is what has enabled financial inclusion to a significant extent. Anybody with a mobile phone is able to transfer money. Immigrant workers, we all saw how, they all came into prominence when they were under distress during the COVID attack. But the way that they were able to communicate with their family, the way they are able to send money home, which is badly needed, the reason in the first place why they become immigrant workers, all this is been possible, this kind of inclusivity, because of these technologies. The privacy part, I think we have already discussed. I don't want to repeat all of that, but clearly it is something which is important, and one has to always strike a balance between convenience and privacy. The part in the question which was unique and different is about the retention of data. And I think this has been a contentious issue even in the recent bill, because there has been a limit kept on the retention of data by private entities, saying that once the purpose for which the data was collected is served, then the data should not be retained. But that limitation is not there as far as the government is concerned. And to some extent, some people have pointed out that this is an asymmetry which needs to be looked at. So retention of data is, I think, a big question. In the earlier draft of the bill, the previous bill which was junked, in fact, there was even the right to be forgotten, but that was perhaps, I think, a little too idealistic. But the bar on retention of data beyond the need is a far more practical approach. I sincerely hope that this question was framed before I had completed part 2, because the burden of my part 2 presentation was essentially to say how you get the requisite resources, number one. And I think I have dwelt on that quite extensively. The second is that in a lot of the cases, this infrastructure and managing a data center, all of this puts a lot of stress within the governmental system. And, signing even maintenance contracts or ensuring that the air conditioning is working continuously. If bills are not paid because of budgetary reasons, they get delayed, etc. So today, almost everything is available on tap, and it is possible to convert all of this capex into an opex by, for example, going to a data center, except for highly sensitive data. If you look at the e-office, for example, highly sensitive files or classified files are not covered. So since this deals only with data which is anyway in the public domain, you can as well use public infrastructure for storing this. So that obviates the need for setting up dedicated infrastructure and all the complexities associated with managing it. Skilled personnel, I have mentioned earlier also how the private sector could be used. But let me make one thing absolutely clear, and I'm glad this question was asked, because you cannot outsource the internal competencies, understanding of what the government wants to do for the citizen, what is the end goal or what was the thinking behind bringing these technologies in. So some minimum capability has to be built internally, and particularly when the officers at the top are transferable and move around, I think it's important to leave a legacy of basic internal capability which can continue to deal with all the external agencies involved, because it involves a huge number of different agencies, and there has to be somebody inside the organization who can talk to all of them with some knowledge and some authority. I think that is really the balance which needs to be struck between trying to get some everything from outside and trying to get everything from inside. It has to be a balance between the two. Well, I was mentioning the example of GSTN itself, and even in the other departments, for example, even in the Enforcement Directorate or even in the banking sector, artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to spot frauds or to point to likely frauds or, likely violation of some rules. In the absence of artificial intelligence, this had to be done manually, and obviously it was very sporadic. It was not possible to cover all the data. And the result was that whoever you picked would say that they are being picked, they are being singled out for harsh action. I'll give you one example. When I was in the Commerce Ministry, suddenly one fine year we found that the exports of IT software to Russia had gone up enormously, And on the face of it, this was very strange because, first of all, Russia was not that big in software, and secondly, they were never importing from India. So there was a suspicion in the RBI that this is not a straightforward transaction. Now, these kinds of things, when you look at the totality of banking, totality of governance, will happen. And let's be clear that this is not an exception. They will happen by the thousands or even more, hundreds of thousands. So you need these vast engines to really pore over the data, match them with patterns, identify deviations from the normal patterns, and then say, okay, look, here is a list of possible frauds, not frauds, but possible frauds. And then, somebody with knowledge, experience can actually look at them and say, yes, these are seem to be fraudulent cases, or these are kosher, they're all right, there's no problem. So I think that's the way in which we need to look at using these technologies in a discriminating way. I think, in my view, this is a complete myth that people propagate sometimes. The question, by the way, is one of the most appropriate questions that has been asked. This myth that I was talking about is that somehow the lower levels are resisting it, and the higher levels are pursuing it with a very noble mission, but somehow the lower levels are all resisting it. My experience has been very, very different. And when they resist, you better listen and find out why they are resisting. I'll give you one example. When an app for the ASHA workers was designed, and they were told that, all you have to do is to load this on the mobile phone, and then you report in this manner, and then it will provide you with this support to deliver even higher quality of services. They thought that the ASHA workers would be jumping with joy. Instead, they were quite reluctant to use something which to the providers seemed to be actually solving their problem. And the reason was, they said, I already have 70 apps which have been dumped on me and I have to fill them up. Now you're giving me the 71st app, which also I have to deal with. So I think one has to look at it from the point of view of the ANSI view. How does the bottom level worker actually deal with this? Does it make their life easier? Do they have to work less? Who doesn't want to work less if they can while still doing their job? Everybody would like to have an easier way of doing things. After all, that's what we do in our daily life. Earlier, we used to buy tape recorders and painfully put one tape after the other, or we used to ring up to the radio station and have a user's choice. Then we started getting these CDs, and then we had USB drives which had many more songs. And today I have to just keep speaking to an Alexa and I can get whichever song in whichever language from anywhere in the world at any time. So all of these, I think, have actually made it easy. The point I'm making is that the more advanced technologies are those which you don't even feel. They are just in the background. You forget that there is very sophisticated technology behind it. So what is important is to make, and therefore sophisticated technology is much easier for ground level staff to use. If you are using, for example, natural language processing, speech to speech, it's not feasible in many cases today because of the levels of accuracy. Google Translate has an accuracy ranging from about 95% for Spanish to 55% for Armenian. For Chinese, it is 82%. For Indian languages, it is Hindi and so on, it's about 72%. Still very short of what is ideally required. So I think the thing is to look at it from the point of view of the lower level worker, to be able to communicate to them. That's why I said change management is 50% of the problem. You have to explain to them why it makes their work easier. And you have to validate it, you have to verify it, you have to get them to confirm it. It is not you telling them that their job has become easier. It is they themselves have to feel that their job is easier. When the Treasury computerization program was done in AP, this was in the 1990s, when all this IT business was at its infancy. The staff who were going home at 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night could leave at 5 o'clock. In banks, when it was brought in, staff who used to work till 10 o'clock were free by about 4 o'clock. Of course, this brought a different problem, that where do they get their overtime from? But I'm not going there. So, one has to deal with and handle these questions and take them along. And if you can package it in the right way, sometimes it requires incentives, sometimes it requires explanation, sometimes it requires cajoling. And not to make too fine a point of it, sometimes it requires, after doing all this, to say, okay, this has to be done. So all of these, I think, are things which test the skill of the manager. These are not technology questions. These are change management and administration and administrative skill that is involved in all of these questions. First of all, I think that the presumption that IT-based solutions are different and AI solutions are different is not entirely correct. An AI solution is also an IT solution, and it rides on IT. And there is usually a base level of IT that is existing on which the AI rests. Even the development of new AI rests on vast amounts of data. Natural language technologies, natural language processing technology capability rests on huge corpora or collections of data, text, voice, recordings, etc., which make it better with the passage of time because it learns from its mistakes. So when we talk about technology, we must be careful not to think about sprinting before we have learned to walk or even crawl. So some degree of usage of IT and familiarity with technology and how it works is an important first step. But as I said, because of all the efforts over the last 3 decades, in most cases, there is something which is already there. And I think it's also important not to just think of jettisoning everything and starting afresh. In most of the cases, this sits nicely as a layer on top of a lot of data which is already there. If you look at GSTN, for example, one way of looking at GSTN today is that there is a IT solution which GSTN has implemented, and the fraud detection or the fraud analysis is done by AI solutions which are sitting on top of that. Same was the case with TB, same was the case with school dropouts. So IT and the AI systems actually have to be harmonized and synchronized and not seen as alternatives to each other. Yes, I think incentives are important. If people are, like is being done in this program, and that what Karma Yogi is trying to do, which is to, give people certificates, try and ensure that their assignments are also linked to their training and so on. And the second thing is training, which is also important, so that people are properly trained, because, you have two extremes of people, one who say that all this technology is rubbish and it's not going to do anything, and the other who say, I'm going to computerize everything. But people have to be far more nuanced than that. But in my own experience, if I can share, most of the time, I found that the best people were those who were excited by the prospect of what they were going to do, by the prospect of what they were going to achieve, by the footprints in the sands of time in governance that they were leaving behind, because that would last long after they had left, the satisfaction that it gives them. So these were extremely strong motivations, and none of the officers who had worked at that time ever once complained about having to stay for long hours in the office, or not being paid overtime for that, or not being given out of turn promotions. So I think we need all of them, but I think communicating the importance of what is being done, communicating the purpose and communicating the value of this to people makes a huge difference. And I would look at that as an important adjunct. Of course, this is not at all to say that incentivization and training on a continuous basis is not important. Lastly, I think it's very important for everyone to be aware of what is happening around us, because it's not just about government and governance. It's also about what's happening in the world. How are different things functioning? I mentioned so many examples of the private sector, how services are being provided, and how even things like Alexa are working, just as an example. So the question to ask is, how are these changes happening, and is there a way in which we can use these in government? How do we integrate them? But remember, government and private sector are, very, very different kettle of fish. In the government, a record is important. Who took the decision is important. How the decision was taken is important. These are not compromisable or negotiable, because its system of public accountability requires that. So those differences cannot be lost sight of. We can't say that, government should function like the private sector, as much as we can't say that the private sector should function like the government and do everything, for free, or try to do everything with only a larger public purpose in mind and not keeping profit in mind. So these work in accordance with very different principles. And I am constantly surprised by how little people in the public sector understand how private sector functions, and vice versa. I have worked on both sides, and to me, it's a continuing mystery how each can be so unaware of the ground rules on the basis of which others function. So I think all of these are things which any vigilant person, any intelligent person should normally be doing, irrespective of whether he wants to be in e-governance or in new technologies. But keeping yourself aware is important, because the world is changing so fast. Every 5 years it is changing. It's hard to imagine that before 2005 there was no social media, there was no Facebook. How much has changed in 3 decades? So unfortunately, we live in a world where the knowledge which we got when we were in college has very, very limited utility. It's the knowledge which we acquire continuously, which is important. So I would just say that, be aware and keep observing and remain a student all your life, no matter what level you reach. That's the only mantra I can suggest. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this session today. We hope you liked the Masterclass session on Being Future Ready. Stay tuned for our next sessions in Being Future Ready series.